The courtroom buzzed with a kind of muted energy that signaled anticipation. Jonathan Crawford strode into the chamber with his usual swagger, his tailored suit pristine, his expression sharp and dismissive. His confidence wasn't just a veneer, it was a weapon he wielded expertly. Crawford prided himself on being the best, and letting everyone around him know it. Today was no different. He glanced briefly at Marcus Bennett, who was already seated at the plaintiff's table, scanning his notes. Crawford's lip curled into a faint smirk. New blood, he muttered under his breath to his paralegal, Jenna, as he settled into his chair. They'll let anyone argue a case these days. Jenna, uncomfortable but trained not to react, focused on organizing the files in front of her. As the session began, Judge Linda Hayes entered, her black robes flowing like the weight of the law itself. The room stood until her sharp, commanding voice instructed everyone to sit. Hayes's reputation preceded her. She was known for her impartiality and for not tolerating nonsense, a fact that rarely deterred Crawford from testing boundaries. Marcus stood to make his opening statement. "Your Honor, members of the court," Marcus began, his voice steady but soft. "This case is about the fundamental principles of ownership and fairness. The evidence will show." Crawford let out an exaggerated sigh, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Judge Hayes's eyes flicked in his direction, but didn't linger. Marcus paused, glanced briefly at Crawford, then resumed as though nothing had happened. But Crawford wasn't done. When Marcus mentioned a key precedent that supported his case, Crawford couldn't resist. "Objection," he said, standing. "Counsel is misrepresenting the significance of that ruling. Perhaps he hasn't had enough experience to fully understand its implications." A murmur rippled through the room. Marcus remained calm, looking directly at the judge. "Your Honor, if opposing counsel would allow me to finish, I believe the context will become clear." Hayes raised a hand, silencing Crawford before he could reply. "Sit down, Mr. Crawford. Let Mr. Bennett continue." The tension was palpable, but Marcus didn't let it deter him. He resumed his statement, weaving his arguments with precision and composure. During a break, Crawford approached Marcus near the water cooler. "Listen, kid," Crawford began, his tone dripping with condescension. "This isn't law school. You're playing in the big leagues now, and you're out of your depth. If I were you, I'd cut my losses before this gets embarrassing." Marcus took a sip of water, unfazed. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Crawford, but I think I'll let the court decide who's out of their depth." Crawford's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Judge Hayes's clerk appeared, summoning them back to the courtroom. The next round of proceedings began, and it was Crawford's turn to present. He rose, his voice booming as he addressed the court. His arguments were polished, his delivery flawless, at least on the surface. But as he continued, Marcus began jotting down notes, his pen moving quickly. Occasionally, he whispered something to his co-counsel, who nodded with a faint smile. When it was Marcus's turn to cross-examine a witness, Crawford leaned back in his chair, arms folded, expecting a lackluster performance. Instead, Marcus's questions were sharp and strategic, uncovering minor inconsistencies in the testimony that Crawford had overlooked. Crawford's smirk vanished. "Objection," he blurted out, his voice louder than necessary. "Counsel is badgering the witness." Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Overruled. Proceed, Mr. Bennett." Marcus didn't gloat or glance at Crawford. He simply continued, methodically dismantling the witness's credibility. By the end of the day, Crawford's frustration was palpable. In the hallway outside the courtroom, he vented to Jenna. "Can you believe this?" he fumed. "That kid's entire strategy is to nitpick and hope I make a mistake. Amateur hour." Jenna hesitated before replying, choosing her words carefully. "He's thorough, sir. The judge seems to appreciate that." Crawford shot her a glare. "The judge will appreciate real legal acumen when I close this case." This isn't a popularity contest. As they passed Marcus and his team, Crawford couldn't resist one last jab. "Enjoy your little moment, Bennett," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "But let me give you some advice. Pedigree matters in this profession. And you, my friend, don't have it." Marcus stopped, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. "Mr. Crawford, he said, his tone measured. "I don't need a pedigree to know the law. I just need the truth, and it always comes out in the end." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Judge Hayes, standing nearby, overheard the exchange. She said nothing, but the look she gave Crawford as she walked past spoke volumes. As the courtroom doors closed behind them, Crawford brushed off the moment as inconsequential. But deep down, a flicker of unease began to settle in the back of his mind. The next morning, Jonathan Crawford entered the courtroom with his usual bravado, though his steps were a touch quicker than the day before. He was determined to reassert his dominance after yesterday's less-than-stellar performance. Marcus Bennett was already seated, flipping through a thick binder of case law. His calm demeanor was infuriating, as if yesterday's events hadn't fazed him in the slightest. Crawford took his seat with a theatrical flourish, making sure to drop his leather briefcase onto the table with a loud thud. "Ready for round 2, counselor?" he quipped, his voice dripping with false cheer. Marcus looked up, offering a polite smile. "Always." The proceedings began promptly, with Crawford calling his next witness, a surveyor whose testimony was meant to cement the defense's argument about property boundaries. The witness was confident at first, delivering rehearsed responses to Crawford's carefully crafted questions. But when Marcus began his cross-examination, the air in the courtroom shifted. "Mr. Evans," Marcus began, his voice steady, "you testified earlier that the boundaries were confirmed using the 1998 land survey, correct?" The surveyor nodded. "That's correct." Marcus stepped closer, holding up a copy of the survey. "Could you point out where in this document it specifies that the disputed land is included within my client's property?" The surveyor hesitated, leaning forward to examine the document. Crawford's jaw tightened as the seconds stretched into an awkward silence. It's here, I believe," the witness stammered, pointing vaguely at the page. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, then held up a different document. "This is a more recent survey from 2015, which appears to contradict your testimony. Were you aware of this survey?" The witness's face reddened. I hadn't reviewed that document." Marcus didn't miss a beat. "So, to clarify, your testimony today is based on incomplete information?" Crawford shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor." Counsel is badgering the witness. Judge Hayes didn't even glance at Crawford. "Overruled. Mr. Bennett, you may continue." Marcus took a step back, giving the witness a moment to recover. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Marcus returned to his seat, Crawford leaned toward his paralegal. "Get me that 2015 survey. Now." Jenna nodded, quickly scribbling a note before leaving the courtroom. The day continued in much the same way. For every polished argument Crawford presented, Marcus found a flaw or inconsistency to exploit. By lunchtime, whispers filled the gallery, and it was clear the momentum was shifting. During the recess, Crawford paced the hallway, his frustration boiling over. "He's playing games," he muttered to Jenna, who had returned with the survey. "Twisting facts to make me look bad. It's amateurish." Jenna hesitated, then spoke cautiously. "Sir, he's not twisting facts. He's just prepared." Crawford shot her a glare. "Whose side are you on?" Jenna didn't reply, pretending to focus on her notes. Back in the courtroom, Crawford tried to regain control. He questioned a key expert witness with his trademark precision, drawing out responses that seemed to bolster his case. But when Marcus stood for his cross-examination, the courtroom braced for another round of fireworks. "Dr. Carter," Marcus began, his tone respectful but firm, "you testified that the soil composition in the disputed area matches the defendant's property, correct?" The expert nodded confidently. "Yes, that's correct." Marcus walked over to the evidence table, picking up a small, sealed bag of soil. "This sample was taken from my client's property line. Would you agree that it's consistent with the defendant's land?" The witness adjusted his glasses, peering at the sample. "I would." Marcus then held up another bag. "And this sample was taken from the disputed area. Would you mind explaining why it appears identical to the first?" The witness blinked, clearly caught off guard. I'm not sure. That's unusual." Marcus pressed further. "Unusual enough to question your earlier conclusion?" Crawford stood abruptly. Objection. Counsel is leading the witness. Judge Hayes sighed, a trace of impatience in her voice. Overruled. Mr. Bennett, proceed. By the end of the day, Crawford was visibly tense, his usual confidence eroded by Marcus's relentless competence. After the session adjourned, Crawford caught up with Marcus in the hallway. You've made your point, Bennett, he said, his tone icy. But let's be clear, you're not in my league. You've had a few lucky breaks, but this isn't over. Marcus turned to face him, his expression calm but resolute. Mr. Crawford, I'm not here to compete with you. I'm here to represent my client. Maybe you should try focusing on that instead of me. Crawford's face darkened, but before he could respond, Judge Hayes appeared at the end of the hallway, her eyes briefly locking onto his. Her expression was unreadable, but the silent judgment in her gaze was unmistakable. As Marcus walked away, Crawford stood frozen, a flicker of doubt creeping into his mind. For the first time in years, he wondered if he'd finally met someone who couldn't be intimidated, someone who might actually be better than him. The third day of trial opened with a sense of quiet tension. The courtroom seemed to vibrate with anticipation, as if the collective audience sensed something pivotal was about to happen. Jonathan Crawford walked in with his shoulders squared and his jaw set, but the confident air he usually exuded was now laced with irritation. Marcus Bennett, as always, was calm and prepared, his meticulous notes laid out neatly in front of him. Judge Hayes entered promptly, her stern expression neutral, but her eyes betrayed a sharp awareness of everything that had transpired. The proceedings began with Crawford calling his final witness, a property consultant whose analysis formed the backbone of his defense. Crawford questioned her with precision, pulling every thread he could to stitch together a compelling narrative. So, Ms. Abernathy, Crawford said, pacing dramatically in front of the jury, based on your years of expertise, would you say it's indisputable that the disputed land belongs to my client? The consultant nodded confidently. Yes, based on all the data, it's clear that the property boundaries favor your client's claim. Satisfied, Crawford turned toward Marcus, his expression daring him to counter. Marcus stood, adjusting his tie as he approached the witness. Ms. Abernathy, Marcus began, his voice steady, you testified that your analysis is based on the official land survey provided by the defense, correct? That's correct, she replied. Marcus held up a sheet of paper, walking slowly toward the jury. This is the document in question, dated 1998. Could you confirm for the court that this is the survey you relied upon? She nodded. Yes, that's the one. Marcus paused, letting the jury take in the moment. Then he retrieved another sheet of paper. Your Honor, this is an updated survey conducted in 2015, which appears to contradict the earlier data. With the court's permission, I'd like to question the validity of Ms. Abernathy's conclusions. Crawford shot to his feet. Objection. Counsel is attempting to introduce evidence without proper notice. Judge Hayes raised her hand. Overruled. Mr. Bennett, proceed. Marcus nodded, turning back to the witness. Ms. Abernathy, would you agree that relying on outdated data can lead to inaccurate conclusions? She hesitated. Well, in some cases, yes. Marcus's voice grew firmer. Would you also agree that omitting key information, such as a newer survey, could mislead the court? Her face reddened. I wasn't aware of the newer survey. Marcus nodded sympathetically. That's understandable. But if you had known, do you think your conclusions might have been different? Crawford interrupted, his voice strained. Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness. Judge Hayes narrowed her eyes at Crawford. Overruled. Mr. Bennett, finish your questioning. Marcus leaned in slightly. Ms. Abernathy, with respect, would you concede that your testimony today might not fully represent the truth due to incomplete information? She shifted uncomfortably. Yes, I would. The jury murmured, and Crawford's expression darkened. The momentum had shifted definitively in Marcus's favor. During the afternoon recess, Crawford confronted Marcus in the hallway, his tone venomous. You think you're clever, don't you? Crawford spat, dragging out technicalities to make me look incompetent. But let me tell you something, Bennett. Real lawyers went on strategy. Not luck. Marcus turned to face him, his composure unwavering. And real lawyers respect the law, Mr. Crawford. Maybe that's why you're struggling. Before Crawford could respond, Judge Hayes stepped into the hallway. Her presence was enough to silence the exchange. "Gentlemen," she said coolly, "if you're done posturing, I'd appreciate it if you returned to the courtroom. We have a trial to finish." The look she gave Crawford lingered, filled with unspoken disapproval. The trial's final moments came down to closing arguments. Crawford went first, pouring all his frustration and remaining confidence into his speech. He painted a vivid picture of fairness and tradition, framing his client's case as the only logical conclusion. It was a strong performance, but the jury's reaction was lukewarm. Then Marcus stood. His voice was calm, but filled with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not about tradition or appearances. It's about the truth, a truth that's been buried under assumptions and incomplete evidence." He paused, meeting each juror's gaze. "My client doesn't have the resources of the defendant, but what we have is right. And today, you have the power to ensure that right prevails." The courtroom was silent as he sat down. When the verdict was announced in Marcus's favor, the gallery erupted into murmurs. Crawford sat frozen, the weight of the loss pressing down on him. But it wasn't just the loss. It was the realization that his arrogance had blinded him. Before adjourning, Judge Hayes stood to address the court. "Before we conclude, I'd like to acknowledge something that has been on my mind throughout this trial." She turned her gaze to Marcus. "Years ago, when I was a young attorney, Mr. Bennett was my mentor. He taught me not just about the law, but about integrity, perseverance, and humility." The room fell silent, and Crawford's face turned ashen. "It is ironic," Hayes continued, her voice steady, "that someone who once guided me now stands here as an example of the very principles we should all uphold. This trial has been a testament to the power of preparation and character." Crawford's humiliation was complete. As the court emptied, he approached Marcus, swallowing his pride. "Bennett," he began awkwardly, "I owe you an apology. I underestimated you, and I was wrong." Marcus extended a hand, his expression sincere. "Apology accepted, Mr. Crawford. Justice isn't about egos. It's about doing what's right." Crawford shook his hand, the first step in a long road toward redemption. The atmosphere outside the courtroom was electric. Reporters and onlookers crowded the halls, eager to catch a glimpse of the unexpected victor. Marcus Bennett stood near the exit, speaking quietly to his client, who was smiling through tears of relief. Jonathan Crawford watched the scene from a distance, his usual bravado gone. For Crawford, this loss wasn't just about a case. It was the first time in years that someone had exposed his vulnerabilities in such a public, undeniable way. "Mr. Crawford," Jenna said softly, standing at his side. "Should we head back to the office?" Crawford didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Marcus, who was now surrounded by well-wishers and reporters. "Give me a moment," he muttered, straightening his tie. He crossed the hallway, weaving through the crowd until he stood directly in front of Marcus. "Bennett," Crawford began, his voice low but audible. The chatter around them died down as people strained to hear. "You've made your point. Congratulations." Marcus turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford." Crawford hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "I was wrong about you," he admitted, his tone begrudging but genuine. "I let my assumptions cloud my judgment." Marcus studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. "We've all made mistakes, Mr. Crawford. The important thing is what we learn from them." Crawford shook his hand, feeling the weight of the gesture. For the first time, he saw Marcus not as an adversary, but as someone worthy of respect. Later that evening, Crawford sat alone in his office. The dim light from his desk lamp illuminated the stacks of papers and legal briefs he hadn't touched all day. His usual confidence had been replaced by an unfamiliar sensation, self-reflection. He opened his laptop and typed Marcus Bennett's name into the search bar. Articles and profiles flooded the screen, each one highlighting Marcus's career and community work. Crawford frowned, clicking on a piece titled "The Mentor Behind the Success: Marcus Bennett's Impact on the Legal Profession." The article detailed Marcus's role in mentoring young lawyers, including none other than Judge Linda Hayes. As Crawford read about Marcus's dedication to ethics and fairness, he felt a pang of something he hadn't experienced in years: admiration. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Jenna peeked in hesitantly. "Sir, I thought you'd want to know. Judge Hayes mentioned you in her post-trial statement." Crawford looked up sharply. "What did she say?" Jenna stepped inside, holding a printed copy of the statement. "She said the case was a reminder that even seasoned attorneys can learn valuable lessons. She specifically called out the importance of humility." Crawford exhaled slowly, the words cutting deeper than he expected. The following week, Crawford sat in the gallery of a courthouse, watching a young attorney argue her first case. He hadn't planned to be there. Curiosity had drawn him in after hearing about the promising lawyer. As he watched her stumble over a question, he felt an unexpected urge to help. After the session ended, he approached her outside the courtroom. "You've got talent," Crawford said, surprising himself with the warmth in his voice. "But you need to tighten your arguments. Stick to the facts and don't let the opposition rattle you." The young lawyer blinked in surprise, then nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford. That means a lot." As he walked away, Crawford realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his own reputation. Meanwhile, Marcus Bennett's victory brought a wave of opportunities. Judge Hayes reached out to formally invite him to co-lead her legal reform initiative, a project aimed at increasing accessibility and fairness in the justice system. Marcus met with her in her chambers, where their conversation felt less like colleagues and more like old friends catching up. "You've come a long way, Marcus," Hayes said, smiling warmly. "But I'm not surprised. You always had the talent and the heart." Marcus chuckled. "I just hope I can live up to the expectations." Hayes's expression turned serious. "You've already exceeded them. This project needs someone like you. Someone who can see beyond the courtroom and into the lives we're trying to impact." The ripple effects of the trial extended further than anyone expected. Crawford, though still struggling with the sting of defeat, began reevaluating his approach to law. He started mentoring younger attorneys in his firm, offering guidance instead of criticism. His reputation, once built on arrogance, began to shift towards something resembling respect. One day, Marcus received an unexpected call from Crawford. "Bennett," Crawford said, his tone awkward but sincere. "I wanted to thank you. That trial, it opened my eyes." Marcus smiled, though Crawford couldn't see it. "I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Crawford. We all have room to grow." For the first time, there was no animosity between them, only the shared understanding of two men who had learned from each other in ways they never anticipated. The case was over, but its legacy was just beginning. Months passed, but the impact of the trial lingered. Jonathan Crawford, once the embodiment of arrogance, had quietly transformed. At his firm, whispers of the change spread as he began mentoring junior attorneys and advocating for more pro bono work. While he still carried his sharp wit and commanding presence, there was a new element to him: humility. One morning, as he reviewed a new case, Jenna entered his office with a hesitant smile. "Mr. Crawford, there's someone here to see you," she said. Crawford raised an eyebrow. "Did they make an appointment?" Jenna shook her head. "No, but I think you'll want to talk to him." Curious, Crawford stood and followed Jenna to the reception area. Standing there, dressed sharply but with his usual calm demeanor, was Marcus Bennett. "Bennett," Crawford said, his surprise evident. "What brings you here?" Marcus extended his hand, and Crawford shook it firmly. "I wanted to stop by and personally invite you to a panel I'm hosting next month," Marcus said. "It's part of the legal reform initiative with Judge Hayes. We're focusing on fostering mentorship and ethical practices in law." Crawford blinked, caught off guard. "You want me on the panels?" Marcus smiled. "Why not? Your perspective would be valuable. And I think your story could resonate with the younger generation." For a moment, Crawford didn't know how to respond. Then slowly he nodded. "I'll be there." The event, held in a packed auditorium, was a resounding success. Crawford sat alongside Marcus and Judge Hayes, their presence drawing a diverse crowd of aspiring lawyers, community leaders, and seasoned professionals. When it was Crawford's turn to speak, he hesitated, looking out at the audience. "I'm not proud of the way I've conducted myself in the past," he began. "But I'm here because I've learned that the law isn't just about winning. It's about respect for your colleagues, for your clients, and for the truth." The room was silent as Crawford continued. "I lost a case recently, but what I gained was far more important. I learned to listen, to collaborate, and to recognize that even the most seasoned professionals have something to learn from those we underestimate." His words were met with applause, but it was the nod of approval from Marcus that truly mattered. After the panel, Marcus and Crawford stood outside the venue, watching attendees mingle. "You handled that well," Marcus said. Crawford chuckled. "I suppose I had a good example to follow." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Don't give me too much credit, Crawford. You've done the work yourself." Crawford turned to him, his expression sincere. "It's funny. For years, I thought being the best meant never admitting weakness. Now, I see it's the opposite." Marcus smiled. "That's the thing about the law. It's not static. It challenges us, forces us to grow. If we let it—" Crawford nodded. Their unlikely friendship solidified in that moment. Back at his office, Crawford reflected on how far he'd come. His bookshelf, once lined with trophies and accolades, now included texts on ethics and mentorship. On his desk, a framed photo of the panel served as a reminder of the lesson he'd learned. The true measure of a lawyer wasn't in their victories, but in their integrity. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to rise in prominence. His role in the legal reform initiative earned him national recognition, but he remained grounded, dedicating himself to mentoring young lawyers and advocating for justice. Months later, Crawford attended a charity gala organized by Marcus and Judge Hayes. As he stood among the crowd, he overheard two young attorneys discussing Marcus. "He's incredible," one said. "I can't believe how much he's done for the profession." The other nodded. "And he still takes the time to help people like us. That's what makes him a real leader." Crawford smiled to himself. He had come to understand that the law, much like life, was less about individual glory and more about collective progress. The case that had once been a source of humiliation was now the foundation of a new legacy, one built on respect, humility, and the pursuit of justice. As the evening went on, Crawford approached Marcus with a glass of wine in hand. "To growth," Crawford said, raising his glass. Marcus clinked his glass with a smile. "To justice." And for the first time in years, Crawford felt like he truly belonged to something greater than himself. Final message. The story ends on a note of redemption and hope, showing how even the most flawed individuals can change when faced with the right challenges. Through mutual respect and a shared commitment to justice, Crawford and Marcus exemplify the transformative power of humility and mentorship in the legal profession.